Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from snowy North Germany. The last, 6 hours, 7 hours, we had 10 centimeters of snow accumulate. So it's quite a sight and quite a nice thing to be inside and talk to a historian today about a fascinating new book. So I am joined today by Bridget Bennett, who is a professor of, and I need to make sure, usually it's historians I have, so this time it's different. I have a professor of American literature and culture with me. She is working at the University of Leeds, and she has published a number of books. I was quite impressed here. It's quite a list. So for example, Ripples of Dissent, Damnation of Harold Frederick, Special Relationship, Anglo-American Affinities and Antagonisms, 1854 to 1932. And to go to our book for today, the newest one, a fascinating book, Antislavery in the Dissenting Atlantic. I shouldn't hold that up since it's the wrong way around. With LSU Press. And I was intrigued by this one because of its subtitle, Archives and Unquiet Libraries. So first of all, Bridget, thank you so much for joining today, taking time out of your day.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And if we're doing weather, which we like to do in where I'm from, it's cold and grey here, but we don't have snow. So there we go. We've cleared the weather up, right?
There we go. Good. It's a very European podcast today.
Yeah.
And very fitting in European weather, actually. So how did you, you're writing about dissenters, so that's religious dissenters, but not necessarily.
Yes, but no. Shall I do that bit first?
Yes, go for how the book came about. Let's go with that.
Okay. So how the book came about, that is a long story, and I guess what I'd say is that the book is one part of the work. So the book's part of the work, but it's not the work. And the work is the thing I started with. So the work started probably just after 2007, when it was the bicentennial of the abolition of the Slave Act in this country. It's been passed in 1807. And there were a number of local and indeed national commemorative events, including some in Leeds, in the city in which I live. Now, anyone who knows England will know that Leeds is a landlocked city. So it's not one of the port cities that we associate with either slavery or abolition. But in the 19th century, it was two things. One was it was the kind of the home of one of the biggest groups of nonconformist dissenters, Quakers and others in the country, who were very transnational in their reach. And that's one thing. And the second thing is it made a lot of money out of textiles. Not cotton, like Lancashire, not predominantly cotton anyway, but wool and linen. But it's closely connected to Liverpool and to Manchester, these other textile cities. Yet at the same time, if we think of Leeds now, when I say to people, "Oh, what do you think about when you think of York?" and they go, "Oh, the Minster and history and medieval stuff," and what do you think about Leeds? Parties, clubs, shopping, and it's true. It is true. But it is also true that Leeds has a really significant radical and social justice history and historiography. And part of that is through its connection to abolition and to anti-slavery. So in 2007, or just after that period, realizing that kind of history of Leeds wasn't really being told enough. It was being told a bit, but not enough. I began to wonder what I could do as a scholar, as someone who lives in this city, to do some work with this. And the university advertised some undergraduate research scholarships where you could work with a first-year student and develop a project.
Oh, cool.
And without ever thinking that I'd write a book on this, because actually I was writing a different book, which I have to say I still haven't finished, but I was fully committed to that other book that I'm apparently not committed to. I started to work on a project with this student, and we put on a series of schools workshops. We made a website. We made some short films. She did a lot of local research. We also, together with local collaborators, put on some performance pieces and also an exhibition in the university's art gallery where I borrowed.
Wow.
I know it was amazing. It was amazing. So I borrowed
Yeah.
items from the National Collection, which I didn't know you can do this actually, but I
Wow.
discovered this. They lend them to institutions for free. You just have to pay the enormous costs of shipping them over to you, which are very high because of the insurance risks. So
Oh,
we
so
were
you
able
couldn't
to.
just go down to London and pick them up and take them on the
I
train
couldn't
back.
couldn't just drive down. No, it turns out not. It's really inconvenient, but it turns out not. So we put all these different things on, and I thought that was the work, right? Having that conversation, having people in there. The exhibition went on for a month or so. Lots of people went to see it. But I also then began to realize there were other things. So one of them was that the student went off and she wrote a dissertation on some of this stuff. So that was great.
Wow.
This was kind of
Yeah.
going into student education. And then I wrote a couple of shorter articles, still thinking that I had this other book I was writing. But just, I realized when people said, "What are you writing?" I described the other book, and they would, within honestly about 20 seconds, I could see they
They
glazed
weren't
over.
interested.
And I just thought, it's not, I'm not really pitching this well. So then I talk about the other work, which I was really interested in, and everybody was excited. And I just thought, that is the book, isn't it? That's the book I have to write. So over a number of years, I started to develop ideas about what I might write. And I knew I wanted it to be focused on transnational, transatlantic aspects of study. You can't tell a story about abolition without it being that, can you? But I particularly also was really interested in, and remain really interested in, not grand narratives about people in the public domain, but I'm interested in the daily, quotidian activities of people, how they meet each other in the street, those kind of conversations they have. That kind, the kind of stuff, that kind of everyday stuff of how life happens. And I knew that would feed interestingly into the story that I wanted to tell. So that was the thing I really wanted to make sure that my book was going to do. I realized I wanted to focus not just on the big public figures who have had attention. They need more, but they've had some attention. But I also wanted to think about, if you're living in a city like this city, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What are the day-to-day iterations that you might experience in the 19th century as someone who might gradually start to imagine what life on the other side of the Atlantic was like, what slavery was like, and so on. And it gradually began to emerge in that way. So as I say, the
Wow.
work was a much bigger thing, but the book is a part of the work, but is not all of the work.
Wow. That is quite a story. And I kind of, when I taught still in the US, I did bring how the UK commemorated slavery and the slave trade into some of my lectures, and was always like fascinating. It did more than the US, which does nothing, but it was still limited, right? Of like I always had the oh, I'm going to blank here. I think is it Cardiff, where they have like the Pedro Bridge, and then Liverpool was the International Slave Trade Museum. But
Yes.
it's really limited, really, what is there to kind of draw public attention, like explicitly. Implicitly, there's a lot that you can kind of point to and kind of draw ties, but it's hard to kind of do that.
I think what happens is that the British like to champion the fact that we, quotes, were not slaveholders, that it didn't happen, as if this is true, which it isn't. So I actually think there is some discomfort in telling the narrative, in telling a narrative that isn't around the British being the champions of the free.
Right.
So telling it in a different way in which you're
Mm-hmm.
raising awareness of the fact that the enslaved were living in Britain,
Yeah.
that, that actually this isn't a history that is hard to trace. Or
Mm-hmm.
it can be, but you have to have the volition, you have to have the will to do it. That's important, telling it in a different kind of way. And a lot
Mm-hmm.
of historians and actually literary scholars too have been really thinking about how we decolonize the curriculum, how
Mm-hmm.
we retell these stories,
Yeah.
um, and how we reimagine, the extent and depth of enslavement, and taking into account where there were enslaved people living in this country, for example. And,
Mm.
if you're doing that, you've also got to think about the things I think about a lot in this book, which is about how you travel, um,
Right.
how you move from place to place, what happens along the way, what accommodates that travel, and how through travel people bump into each other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a
Yeah.
book that's, one of the things that's characterized within this book is a series of random encounters that people have that lead to substantial consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
so, and that's something as someone who talks on trains or talks to anyone I meet all the time, I like that. I'm really interested in what happens when strangers just end up meeting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you
Um,
must be. You're a fun one on the National Train Service.
Oh, they probably hate me. I'm one who looks out of the window and then turns to my companion and speaks to them. Oh, they're obviously they want to have their head in a podcast like this. They don't want to talk to a middle-aged woman, but I like talking.
Yeah, my advisor reminded me of that one time when I complained about how in the line at the post office in London, no one was talking to each other, and he was like, "Well, they never got introduced to each other, so why would they talk to each other?"
Yeah, that's true enough.
But come on,
Yeah,
a
driving
little
on the
bit.
subway in London, it's not, people aren't talkers at all. But I
No,
think there are regional elements to this as well, I would say. If you
sure.
live in Yorkshire, I think strangers are much more likely to talk to each other. It's a different kind of
Mm,
feel about things. So again, that's part of what the book is addressing too, is this sense that I don't want to produce a narrative that flattens things out. I'm really
mm,
interested in the kind of variance between different places. Um,
mm,
so actually, the book opens about half a mile down the road from where I'm sitting right now, in a speech that's made, or in an event that's taking place, I should say, on a very cold December evening, because we like cold
mm.
December evenings here. And
For some reason.
for some reason. And one of the things you hear as the speech is reported in the press, you can hear the audience responding and saying kind of
Mm,
very local kind of things. It's this very kind of, um, it's this it takes place in a very big hall, but it's a very voluble kind of
mm,
crowd who shout things out. And I think
mm.
that's really characteristic of the place that I live in at the moment. I think it kind of, that's how it operates, for good
Uh-huh.
and for bad, I'd say.
Well, I'm not going to comment there. That's- but it also kind of it's a bit hidden, but it also seems like this was a very personal story and personal things that you wanted to bring into the book, because one of the artifacts that you said, is was passed down in your family.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other day I looked. So let me just step back from that one second, and then I'll come to it. So the book, in order to write the book, I had to have time away from teaching and other things. So I
Mm,
applied for a research grant, which I was fortunate enough to get. It started in September 2020, COVID time. Um, so I had a plan for what the book was going to be,
mm-hmm,
in which this artifact was just a very small part of the conclusion of the book.
mm.
But as
Oh,
I tried, so it wasn't central to the book at all.
uh,
It now opens the first
mm-hmm,
chapter of the book.
mm-hmm,
But as I started to write the book, I realized that it was more or less impossible for me to write the book I wanted to write, because I couldn't travel. I was at home. Um, the libraries I wanted to access were all closed and would be for a very long period of time. The archives were closed. Archivists and librarians were absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'm
mm,
really interested in archives, and Unquiet as well as quiet libraries, as the book's title suggests, were really brilliant at sending information, sending stuff. But a lot of them couldn't go to work. So they had to wait. They'd say, I'm going into wherever it is in 3 weeks' time, and I will try to send you a link to something then. So there was a lot of waiting that was involved, which also made me imagine my 19th century figures quite a lot. Things took time, and you had to allow that to happen. But as time went on, I just realized that, again, the book I thought I wanted to write wasn't the book that should be written. And all the time I had this artifact in front of me, and I thought, well, actually, I could write about this, because there it is. And the artifact is a beautiful late 18th century sampler sewed by a young girl called Eliza Bevington, who was a Quaker girl who lived in the Cotswolds, so in Oxfordshire. She was one of my ancestors. I don't think of myself as having Quaker ancestry because I don't really know much about it. But this was an item that had been handed down in my family. I'd never particularly looked at it, never really taken it particularly seriously. But during lockdown, I had a chance to look around me in the very limited space I had and to take things more seriously. And I began to realize that if I really wanted to think about how abolitionism and anti-slavery was experienced in the daily lives of people, looking at schools might be quite a good way of thinking about this, because I knew that obviously many people don't have access to schools. They just, especially then, they didn't. But actually, Eliza was one of the first generation of Quaker children to have access to a school, to go to school, but specifically to go to a Quaker school that would give her a guarded education. So an education that was was kind of corresponded to the precepts of the Society of Friend. And this school was opened in Yorkshire, 15 miles from here, in the late 18th century. And that's where she sewed her sampler. And Quakers keep really great records. The school has a great set of records. And I knew a few things about it, but not much. And I began to realize that actually it would be really fascinating to find out more about who attended the school, whether the dissenters that I was interested in had connections to the school. It turns out that many of them had. And the more I found out about the school, the more I realized that this school, honestly, kind of in the middle of nowhere, it was very remote at this point, a long way away from the capital, also not that close to the kind of major cities, not of this country, had international visitors. It had visitors regularly coming to it from the United States. It had school children attending it who were living in Russia, would come over to be educated, Quaker children, even from as far afield as Australia. So you begin to realize that though you imagine yourself focusing on something that's very local, indeed rural, and indeed remote, it's actually at the heart of a transnational network. Letters are going backwards and forwards, people are going backwards and forwards, and these sewn artifacts that I began to focus on travel when the people who sew them travel. So they turn up literally all over the world. And Ackworth samplers, embroidered samplers, which were part of the training of young girls of a variety of social backgrounds, by the way. They learnt to sew samplers for lots of different reasons, but they often end up on the walls of houses long way from where they've been sewn, and they take their messages with them. So I began to realize that this thing that was in my house when I couldn't really leave my house, and all I could do was look at it, was something really worth thinking deeply about, rather than walking past as I went off to do something more interesting outside of the house, as we all tend to do.
And just for kind of understanding purposes, like I'll put the picture you send me, the samplers that we're talking about. I can put the picture up to allow people to see it. And what is a sampler? Why did these young schoolgirls do samplers?
Well, so they have a very long history. Women have got a long-standing relationship with embroidery. Not just women, men too, but particularly in the kind of education for young women, it's an important thing. It's a sampler will teach. So a sampler is an embroidered piece of cloth. In this instance, this one is embroidered using flax, not cotton, linen. It's embroidered on a linen background using flax. So it is not using cotton, which is also in and of itself interesting. Obviously, there are obvious reasons why Quakers would not want to be using cotton at this period. And it would teach stitching. So it could be used to teach certain types of stitching so that it was a part of the domestic education of a young girl. She'd be able to show it to prospective marriage suitors to show that she could do the things that young women were expected to do when they were married. It could be a way of showing off her domestic skills. It could be a way of inculcating with her a set of kind of ideas of the way she should be in the world, a religious ideology, for instance, so that often texts would be sewn. And they might be a text from a poem. It wouldn't be from a novel, not for a Quaker of this generation, but it's more likely to be from a religious text or a moral text. But also, and I hadn't realized this until I was writing the book, women used them. I did know that they were used to establish family trees, so to keep a record of history. But you begin to find them being used, say, in the Revolutionary War in the US, to establish relationships so that women could get war pensions, for instance, after their husbands died. So they're actually used for a wide array of things. And one of the most moving, well, I discovered a lot of very moving samplers, but one of the most moving ones I discovered was one that was sewn in this country by a young woman who had been employed as the tutor to the daughter of a religious minister, who then refused to pay her bill. And when she complained, he had her locked up for the rest of her life in a psychiatric hospital. And she stayed there for the rest of her life. And she sewed these really extraordinary petitions to the Queen complaining about what had happened to her, until gradually, when nothing happened, she gradually just grew quieter and quieter and kind of accepted it. But you can see they're used for many, many different things because, and again, part of the argument of the book is, once you teach someone to sew, you're giving them access to a form of creativity that can be used in many different ways, including not the way that was intended. But also, so that's what a sampler is. It is a sampler that shows various forms of stitching and can be used in various ways. But of course, what you realize is that it's not just privileged girls who learn this, that a lot of girls and women learn to sew. And I was very interested in not just thinking about girls learning to sew at school for these kind of reasons, but also the ways in which seamstresses and women who sewed were making, for example, in the case of Ellen Craft, sewing the trousers as part of her disguise so that she could escape from enslavement. Or women were supporting their families in slavery by sewing things that they could take in and then could save their own money to then hopefully purchase the freedom of other family members. So sewing became something that wasn't just, in the book, it's not just something about what certain kinds of women do at school, but it becomes a much bigger subject. And it becomes a subject too in which you see, if we're thinking about women sewing things that they're not necessarily supposed to be sewing, you can then start seeing the ways in which you can trace international cross currents of sewing. So women were sewing items which were then being sold at anti-slavery bazaars on both sides of the Atlantic to support the production of anti-slavery print. Some of this printed matter couldn't have been made without the money that was being brought in by the sewn objects that were being sold. But these objects are not the ones that get our attention most of the time. We're often much more focused on print because for lots of reasons.
Oh, trick question. Can you stitch like that?
I was taught to sew at school.
Okay.
And although I don't really sew very much, I could if you made me, I could do it. But maybe no, I could actually. I could. I never do. But I find it very restorative and kind of meditative. But I don't do it.
No, it's kind of funny that you brought that up as sort of like that's what young women were taught and having to do, and like I don't remember us doing it in school. And as a kid, my female or even male classmates doing it. But when my son came here and we put him in a Waldorf kindergarten, my wife had to actually stitch his name onto like a piece of linen. And it was like, she was like, how do you do that? Why do they assume that people know this? And
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know. I really don't. But it's sort of those old leftovers that we still have in society.
Yeah, and I mean, I over Christmas, I have to say, there were various things that need to be sewn, and I took huge pleasure in just sewing and mending things
Mm-hmm.
and darning things, and
Yeah.
it's really, it's just, there'll be loads of people who will just say, of course it's a great thing to do, but it's those of us who spend more time writing often forget
Yeah.
about these kinds of things. Um, so yeah.
Indeed. No, and I think that was sort of one of the extremely interesting parts about your book, to kind of say, and how did you phrase it? I think I put it into my notes, that you kind of you wanted to avoid a hierarchy where print trumps other sources. And I found that really interesting, because as historians and even people doing literature, we fall so often into that trap that the
Mhm.
written text is the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, the the printed text is the thing that often has longevity.
Mm,
So it can be the thing that we can access.
mm,
So, and of course, we've all grown up with them. We've been trained in
right.
thinking about them, and so on and so forth. But but the printed text is also an exclusionary form. There are many people
Mm-hmm.
who can't access it because they're not literate, or because people don't think they're worth including, or for all of
Mm-hmm.
those reasons.
Yeah.
So I was, I really didn't want the printed text to be the thing in this book, to be the thing that
Mm,
I focused on above
right.
all else. I wanted to think about how print can capture certain kinds of occasions and meetings, but also what it excludes. So,
Mm,
very deliberately with this book, I was thinking about how I could open the book or what I could write in the prologue,
mm,
and I call it a prologue rather than an introduction. I don't know why, I just did. But anyway, the prologue, I wanted it to kind of be the thing that brought you into the
mm-hmm.
book. So I very deliberately and kind of as a kind of way of trying to be a little subversive, actually, in terms of what the book's about, I started with a public occasion, which was a
Mm,
set of speeches being given in the sort
right.
of thing that is captured in newspapers. And I
Mm-hmm.
looked at newspaper accounts to think about this. But I was also really interested in those newspaper accounts that they did include the sound of voices and vocal
Mm-hmm.
interventions. So they're included in parentheses. So I began to think about what must it have sounded like. And
Mm,
it's a site that I'm familiar with, this particular location. It's very big, it's very grand, it's very beautiful. There
mm,
are lots of echoes. So I was thinking about all of that. But then I was also thinking, but who's not in the room and who never
mm,
gets into the newspaper? And how can I tell their story? So I very deliberately open with this and say, but that's not the story of anti-slavery, is it? That is
mm,
a version of this story.
right.
And I'm going to tell another version, which is also itself a
Mm,
partial version. Um,
right.
and it's through telling multiple partial
Mm,
versions that we can try to move towards not the truth in inverted commas. I'm not sure we
mm,
can get there, but we can at least get to something that's a bit more multifaceted, a bit more profound, maybe,
mm,
and that moves away from the usual actors, the usual
yeah.
people we think of as leading these things. So this was a collection of men meeting, and presumably all of those men were white. Well, we're never told this, but for that very reason, we can
Mm,
probably establish this. So who's not in the room then? And it's just, practically everyone else is
yeah.
not in the room at this point.
Right.
So I immediately move away from this and go into
Mm,
different parts of this city and then beyond this city
mm,
to imagine what other people were doing that night, specifically women and children.
mm,
Um, and
right.
then the enslaved in various locations, and then free blacks, and a whole
Mm,
set of other people who are
yeah.
all central to this story that's being told. And in that way, I seek to kind of I suppose, make the story I'm telling unquiet, to kind
Mm-hmm.
of, again, to move it away from a quiet library containing print into thinking about something that's unquiet, that can be made to speak. And then once you open that box, you can't close it again. And I really like that idea that you open the box of voices, and
Mm-hmm.
they kind of emerge from it, and then you've got to reckon with them
Right.
and be accountable to them as well. As a scholar, you've got to be accountable to these things that you open up.
Mm. Well, I think it's also sort of a Western arrogance, right? Like I always remember my Western Civ teacher at McNeese State when I first semester there, and he basically was like, "So we're going to start with the Mesopotamian civilization because they are the first that left writing, and everyone else who didn't write doesn't matter."
Yeah.
Like, and it's like, well, but they did matter because they existed and they had things to say to our existence as well. So it's that's why I really enjoyed that kind of diversity of like bring these like samplers and kind of like even the boycott movement that you have, and sort of the ways of how can you move beyond the traditional.
Yeah, I mean, so that was something I was really interested in as well, because I'd never known that much about sugar boycotts, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I'd
Yeah.
read a fair bit about them, but I'd never really known a huge amount. And I just thought, I didn't know much about the relationship between the earlier boycott in the
Mm-hmm.
British phase of anti-slavery to what happens in the 19th century, when after 1833, there's a shift towards thinking about US enslavement,
Mm-hmm.
rather than thinking about the West Indies, or thinking less about
Mm-hmm.
the West Indies, say. And one of the things that particularly interested me then, as I say, thinking about that, but thinking about childhood,
Mm-hmm.
was thinking about what the children, as now adults in the period I was studying, the children of some of these early boycotters learned from being children, and how much childhood experience forms dissenting
Mm-hmm.
adults. And so one of the people I looked at in the second chapter in particular was someone who has is usually only thought of in a very one-dimensional way, I think, and that figure is Anna Richardson, who was a Quaker woman who also, of course, attended Ackworth School. And she moved as an adult to Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast
Mm-hmm.
of England, and spent the rest of her life absolutely involved in abolitionist and other forms of activism and educational activities and social justice issues to do with peace, to do with free produce. But she's remembered for one thing, which is purchasing the manumission of Frederick Douglass. Now, you know, that's not a bad thing to be remembered for, frankly, but um, but that's only a part of the picture, and it
Right.
doesn't suggest the really complicated relationality of all the other things that she did,
Mm-hmm.
nor does it also suggests that she's somehow exceptional,
Mm-hmm.
which she is and she isn't.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in thinking about what I could find out about her childhood, which
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a great deal, because for a lot of the figures I look at, there are really big archival absences. But I could find out that she learned peace activism and sugar abstention from her parents.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about her father's refusal in the period of the Napoleonic Wars to provide um, anything that might assist the coaches that were going past their house that were trying to celebrate war victories.
Mm-hmm.
He just wouldn't do it. But
Right.
then
That's
once
he's
the
a
war
Quaker,
was,
right? I
he's a
mean,
Quaker, so
yeah.
he just wouldn't do it. But when the war was over, he was celebrating peace. So she learned
Mm-hmm.
her peace activism from this example. And then she talks about her mother's sugar abstention. Sugar abstention's often more associated with the people I look at, really, amongst women. It's a consumer boycott activity. So
Right.
women being depicted as consumers
Mm-hmm.
governing household choices are often targeted by these campaigns. So, these two things, learn from early childhood, then she goes to Ackworth School, then she ends up living with this very celebrated family, a kind of
Mm.
dominant family of Quakers in the northeast of England who are also grocers. Well, where else would you want to, establish a sugar boycott? You
Yeah.
you start to you start to stock free produce,
Mm.
cotton in your shop, and you start to advocate for it. So you do again see this kind of relationality of all these
Mm.
different activities.
Mm.
And she kind of really extraordinarily, when she really starts up free produce campaigning, um, as an ally of a number of figures in the US, including Samuel Rhodes and others who come to stay with her in
Mm.
England, and Elihu Burritt, I think his name is, um, who called himself the learned blacksmith, who was a really
Mm.
important and I think under reckoned with figure too. She's one of the people who persuades Henry Highland Garnet to come to
Mm.
England and to advertise, to be
Mm.
part of this campaigning. And she takes him to this tiny little school on the coast of Northumbria that she's running for poor children. It's a ragged
Mm.
school. And she gets him there to talk to them about his experience as an enslaved person. Now
Mm.
I know this bit of the world, and it's not very ethnically diverse, but I
Right.
imagine that, in the 1850s it would absolutely not be. And I kept trying
Mm.
to imagine to myself, what must it have been like? He writes
Right.
about his experience of going there, but what must it have been like for those children as well?
Mm-hmm.
What must they have taken from this?
Right.
So you begin to have this, this picture of this
Mm.
transnational set of movements, but also these impactful occasions
Mm.
that I can't trace. I haven't
Right.
found any accounts of what these children may have written or the
Mm.
stories they've told, but that would have changed their lives. I'm sure of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and like in this moment, I have like two questions in my mind that I'm kind
Mm,
of thinking about, because in part you're thinking you're talking about this boycott movement at a time when it's like it's the Industrial Revolution, and like consumerism is taking off, right? I mean, like
hmm
I always remember when I taught the American Revolution, talking about Americans, how they were so infatuated with British products because they
Yeah.
loved consuming. Like, so I can only imagine how British people were thinking in the same way of like, and to then say, no, we're not buying sugar from slaves, or we're not buying cotton. That's a
hmm
huge step.
It's a massive step. And a massive step reinforced by every part of a way of
Mm.
life which was about trying to uphold certain ethical standards.
Mm-hmm.
And that included not reading certain things or reading certain other things. That included, it often included engaging in other activities, which might be preaching or work outside the house, prison visiting for women,
Mm-hmm.
or a whole set of other things. It's a
Right.
really kind of complicated set of other things, and included peace activism, as I've said. I mean, in the period of
Mm-hmm.
the late 1840s to late 1850s, there were a series of peace fairs in the European capitals, which
Mm.
people from all over the place went to. And I sometimes I do think too that perhaps some of their
Mm.
significance has maybe been underwritten. I mean, I don't know
Right.
the historiography of this area, and it may well be that I'm just not reading the right stuff. But um, linking some of these things together seems to me
Mm.
to be still something that really needs to be
Mm.
done. And
Mm.
thinking more not about these things in separation from each other, but thinking of these
Mm.
things as relational.
Right.
I guess that's what I'm trying to do in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that needs to be done, or that I try to do in this piece of work,
Yeah.
not as a kind of totality, but as a way. And one of the things I do in this book is I have a lot of footnotes and a lot of references, and I wanted it to be a book that other people could pick up and think, oh,
Yeah.
this stuff, I can do this, I can
Mm-hmm.
go on and take this on another journey, because I
Yeah.
do think there's just such a lot that needs to be done still.
No, and I think that's always when you write a book, right? That's the thing that you're wanting to to have as the outcomes that people take something and go on with it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
but while you were, the other parts I was thinking about when you were talking is sort of the challenge that we face as historians, that there are like these silences in the archives that we just can't get around, right? Like, I mean, we have a whole book on silence in the past, but in my research, I always remember, like, there's this guy I study. I know he's going to Mexico. I know he's seeing his dad's grave. I finally have his diary in my hands from that trip, and it's like, completed my stuff in Mexico. Next entry,
Yeah.
I'm in New Orleans, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
the one section I wanted, you don't explain, and it's amazing what silences that we have. And do you feel like some of this material culture that you were looking at helps overcome those silences?
Yeah, I think it does to some degree, particularly in terms of women's lives, because
Mm-hmm.
there's so much that we don't know. But
Right.
what we can start to do is, I mean, we can start to use the kinds of methodologies that figures like Saidiya Hartman and
Mm-hmm.
others have suggested about critical fabulation. And
Right.
I've got a phrase I use in my book, which is about the almost surely or the almost certainly, which is a phrase that mathematicians use
Mm.
to think about something that the you're short of evidence, but all the
Mm.
evidence you have points to something that's the really probable outcome, and you have
Yeah.
to somehow believe that this may have happened.
Mm.
So I do, but I was giving a talk about this fairly recently, and someone in the audience made a really interesting point, which was
Mm.
about, isn't there some kind of anxiety about doing this in a post-truth era where everything goes? And I said, yes, there is, and I think we do have to be worried about this. But I
Mm.
also think that um, if you establish a kind of a kind of the trust of your readers that you've done
Mm.
all you can to try to find
Right.
this piece of information,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're rigorous in your research,
Mm.
when this gap happens, it isn't unrealistic to think that you can fill it in some way, or that you
Mm.
can at least suggest a possible outcome.
Right.
And I do think, and perhaps it's because I'm not a trained historian, I do think sometimes that there just is not evidence for everything, because there
Mm.
isn't. Because if we're thinking that print is not the only source,
Mm-hmm.
or is not the source where truth lies, we have to look to other things.
Mm.
And if that evidence isn't there because it hasn't been gathered, because the people we're studying are not considered worthy of attention, you're not going to find it there. So
Mm.
what does that mean? Does that mean there are certain stories we can just never ever tell? So then there are some people who never get looked at, and some
Mm-hmm.
histories that we just don't, and then what's the consequence? That there are some histories that just can't be valued? I
Right.
don't think that's I don't think that's the way of thinking about the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh, let's change gears a little bit, because I do want to talk about the libraries that
Okay.
you do have in your title. And I, like, the first thing I want to know is, I know what a library today looks like, but what do I have to imagine in, like, 1830s, 1840s a library looks like?
Well, it depends which sort of library you're thinking about, of
Your
course.
choice.
Yeah, okay. So I guess as in everything in this book, I look at scales, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the word that I particularly like, which comes from the social sciences, the idea of the multi-scalar. So, your library might be your personal library, which might
Mm-hmm.
consist of 2 books, or even 1 book, or 1,000 books. Um, and if you are wealthy and if you're a man, it's much more likely to consist of more books, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the idea of the personal library is important, those things that you purchase and own and can lend to your friends or whatever. And there are certainly examples of those that I'm thinking about. Around the late 18th century, so in early America or in this
Mm-hmm.
country too, you also start to get other kinds of libraries being founded. So these are often subscription libraries, private subscription
Mm-hmm.
libraries, um, And we can think of the Library Company of Philadelphia as one of those.
Mm.
Or in Leeds, there's the Leeds Library, the commercial library. And these are places where the subscribers are usually men,
Mm.
usually men of a certain class because they can
Mm.
afford to subscribe. And these libraries weren't usually open to women. And of
Mm.
course, they were invariably only open to whites as well. So that
Mm.
that shouldn't go without saying. That should be said. And in the case of the Library Company, one of the things we know is that some of its members and some of its money comes from enslavement. So even while it contains books and people who are committed to anti-slavery, it has a very ambivalent and problematic relationship to the economics of
Mhm.
slavery itself.
Right.
So some of the figures that I write about participated in these libraries, these subscription libraries. As the century starts to go on a bit, you also start to get other kinds of libraries. So you get the important reading rooms in the
Mm.
US where free blacks would go to access books. And these are
Mm.
vital to the creation of a black public sphere.
Mhm.
And they're also vital places where people can gather and exchange information orally about
Mhm.
what's happening in the world and about
Mm.
stuff that's going on. And this is where I start to have the idea of the library as a place that's also unquiet, because it's
Mm.
not just being a silent site of silent
Mm.
study producing silent books, but it's
Mm.
producing this kind of vocal and evocative public sphere
Mm.
that is disquieting people, that's kind of challenging the status quo, that is producing different voices in multiple ways,
Mm.
not just in terms of what's on the shelves, but in what it makes possible through virtue
Mm.
of existing in the world. So those are kind of, it's later still in the 19th
Mm.
century that we start to get public libraries being founded, of course. But a lot of these early libraries are still very exclusionary.
Mm.
And they often exclude women, as I said, but almost invariably they're also particularly white focused. They're focused on white
Mm.
subscribers. But also in the book, I think of people themselves as living libraries.
Mm.
So people who have knowledge that isn't necessarily written knowledge or read knowledge because they don't necessarily have literacy, but
Mhm.
have really profound knowledge of the worlds they're living in, how they can operate within them,
Mm.
medicine, all those things,
Mm.
horticulture, sewing, all those kinds of forms of knowledge that produce rich lives, but they're not written. But
Mhm.
they can produce that knowledge when it needs to be produced.
Yeah. And it's also sort of like a part of what it reminded me of is sort of the, like, when I read in British history, the kind of like the coffee shop in London, like in the 1660s, 1680s, that's sort of the emergence of the public sphere. And sort of it seems the library is sort of a continuation and morphing of that public sphere into other places with other conversations.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think that's right. And I think they become increasingly important to that serendipity of libraries too. You can
Mm-hmm.
go into a library and find out things about worlds that have nothing to do with your world,
Right.
and that then produces, the coffee house produces
Mm-hmm.
a whole set of things, including a kind of public political sphere too.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm
Yeah.
also interested in the library as a place producing imaginative
Mm-hmm.
imaginative understandings of worlds that are not our own,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and empathetic and emotional and
Mm-hmm.
intimate imaginings too of the lives of others,
Mm-hmm.
as well as places in which maybe we can project into them and imagine our
Mm-hmm.
own lives as belonging
Mm-hmm.
as part of them too. I mean, one of the things that I should have said about libraries too is that these early schools that I look at, so Ackworth, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
or some of its US counterparts, because Ackworth is a very important model for some of the American Quaker schools that are emerging subsequently, and that are really looking at the curriculum of Ackworth, sometimes using it and sometimes thinking it's inadequate and moving away from it,
Mm-hmm.
but also looking at the library contents and contributing books to its library, but also emulating it in other ways. So you also see that, these schools start to have libraries that can be accessed by the young people being educated there. And they're often, in their earliest inception, really restricted. Like I said, they don't contain novels because that's not the kinds of things that Quakers think of as instructive and appropriate. They're much too, well, potentially immoral and distracting and entertaining. They're not leading to higher thoughts. But this gradually changes over time. So libraries are also really interesting indexes of cultural and social and kind of religious beliefs at particular points. So I did spend quite a lot of time looking at library catalogues and purchasing data to see who's buying what when and why. You can begin to work out why then as well.
Yeah, no, interesting. And I was also thinking about because you talk about the women and their reading societies as sort of is that sort of an outgrowth of oh, we can't go into the library, so we're going to have a group of us that shares a book and reads it together, and kind of then I assume that also would have involved a conversation about the contents of the book and kind of the larger implications.
Yeah, definitely. We know that women, if we're thinking about sewing again, embroidered samplers, if they were sewing together, they might be talking, or they might be listening to somebody reading a book, and there would be choices being made about what that book would be. So that's these circles often taking place within the home or somewhere where women would gather together to sew collectively. That's one form of the dissemination of bookish information, I guess, and then subsequent discussion of it. Also, of course, they'd be sewing texts, which would come from books, from libraries. So there's also that kind of process of taking a text and turning it into stitching. And then, as I said before, it would then be displayed on a wall. So that becomes another form of textual encounter you can have from within the home, say, that you're looking at not just libraries as a source of textual instruction, but also things that are on the wall. And subsequent to writing the book, I've recently written an article which is about, it is explicitly about these communities and reading groups, again, which I don't think we yet know enough about, but we do know a lot. We are starting to know more about the circulation, the scribal circulation of poetry between women in letters, particularly Quaker women in letters and other places. So you can see that this was absolutely thriving. And while they might not immediately have entered the print public sphere, some of these letters that they're circulating and some of the poetry in them does eventually end up in print. So you can see a kind of long process of incubation where, ideas are vocalized, enter into writing, enter into letters. Let's not forget, letters were often read aloud to groups. They weren't private. They were seen very differently from the way we sometimes imagine letters. Although, do we think of letters any longer? Do we just send emails
I
now,
don't think
we?
so.
No, we send texts,
So
emojis.
I had to send Christmas cards to my parents this year, so that was weird.
I don't even send those any longer.
I know. We
Yeah.
gave that up 2-3 years ago.
Haven't the Danes just stopped the postal system on some of their remoter islands? Yeah.
Yep.
So maybe we'll go back to pigeon post. I don't know. We'll go back to something. So yeah, I think, again, if we think of the multi-scalar, there are different ways of information being circulated and texts and words and ideas being circulated. And thinking of this as happening inside the library, but also outside of the library, seems to me to be really important.
Yeah. And that's it's sort of the part that takes your book beyond sort of the standard of oh, well, they read this book. Well, yeah, but they did that in specific physical spaces or in different specific or unspecific, because we don't know, conversations. So that, again, I find that very interesting. So since I want to keep an eye on a little bit on the time, and I do want to spend a good bit of time on one of the chapters. There will be enough for people to read about that we leave. But one chapter that stood out to me, this might might be the shock, because you're kind of like, oh, why did you pick that chapter, not this one? This is my favorite. Is the one that you open with the 1851 census in the UK. That was just, in so many ways, that chapter was just so incredible.
Thank you.
So,
So,
you're welcome. But let me take it part by part, so we can kind of. The first part that intrigued me was the Croft family, right? That you have the Crafts here in the UK. I did not, like, when I looked at your book and I was like, "Ooh, this sounds like an interesting book." I did not expect that, so I was impressed, and it was so incredible because I lived for 8 years in Macon, Georgia, where they came from, and I had a student, not one of mine, but I worked with him somewhat closely while he was there in his last year. He was working with the National Park Service in the Atlanta office, putting together a panel that they put outside the house where the Crafts were enslaved. So it was such an interesting coincidence that I lived in the town where a character that you have living in a town that then creates this whole story comes together.
yeah, it's that is amazing. It is, and actually, it speaks exactly to what I'm thinking about. How do we join up these stories? How do we understand that these stories are not local stories are never just local. Local stories are never just parochial. All of these things are embedded within much richer, deeper, broader histories. How do we bring out, or at least suggest some of these things? So structurally, each chapter of the book opens with an object or something. It's kind of it's kind of a bit crude. It's a way of getting the reader to be interested in things, and
Gotta hook them somewhere.
you've got to work it out somehow, and it's also a way of linking through various things, kind of various thematics of the book. The story of this one comes back to, as I said, the exhibition that we held way back in 2010, I think it was, when after the exhibition I was emailed by a colleague, a historian who's sadly since died, and I always want to honour this example of collaborative intellectual engagement, which is what I love about the jobs that we do. And he sent me details of this intervention in the census, which I kind of knew about a little but didn't know about. And what this is, just to explain what it is in the 1851 UK census, on the night of the census, William and Ellen Craft were staying in the house of an abolitionist in Leeds called Wilson Armistead and his wife Mary Armistead. And for whatever reason, and I didn't quite know why at the time, they managed to enter them in the census as it just these two words stand out: fugitive slave. It's underlined. So this is the UK census. It's not the US census. They're not slave schedules, though. We've seen these Crafts appearing just before this in the US, first when they're staying in Boston, having escaped enslavement, and also probably in slave schedules that I managed to trace. But here is this thing, and it's just extraordinary. So I began to think, oh well, okay, the Crafts were lecturing in England, and they had escaped from they had escaped after the Fugitive Slave Act. They were two of the many formerly enslaved people who were lecturing in England. Most famously Frederick Douglass, but they were lecturing at this point with William Wells Brown. So I thought, okay, well, Wells Brown obviously staying the same night. Let's look him up in the census. And he is staying in another part of Leeds, and he's in the census. He's called an anti-slavery activist. So I looked up all the black abolitionists I could think of who were staying in the UK that night. I just looked them every single one up. None of them were described in this way. None of them. So it was really interesting to me. And it was obviously a piece of opportunistic political
Mm-hmm.
activism. I call it guerrilla inscription. And I was just thinking, wow, well, why did they? Well, I know why they did this, but kind of how did they do this?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not easy to get this written into the census. And I
Right.
knew that suffragettes or suffrage activists in the early teens had managed to do this. But I know also that they weren't having to go through the elaborate administrative
Mm-hmm.
process that people had to go through in 1850. So this was one I just thought, well, I can't leave it at this. And I really did really
Mm-hmm.
exhaustive research to try to work out precisely what had happened. Um, and in the end, it's a really complicated story about local dissenters being very dissatisfied with a local census enumerator, and kind of the kind of very local politics of this city. Um, and I think maybe even slightly blackmailing the person who was collecting the census data, who felt that they had to include this, even though the census data goes through a set of rigorous forms of scrutiny, and it should not have got there, but it did. So it was
Yeah,
amazing to me.
and that's like for especially for American listeners, it's like I I just found like there's a lot that I found fascinating, but that section where you kind of chronicle how the census works was just fascinating. Of like everyone on this one night, this guy gets his paper and has to delivers the next day who stayed in the house, like it like right, like what if you were on vacation and no one stayed at the house, or you had a big party and half the
And
family
everyone was
stayed
there.
over,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it is amazing. And I have to say I really loved that really kind of detail, that level of detail. I really enjoyed doing that
Mm-hmm.
research. But then I also really started to think about what this kind of archive, I
Mm-hmm.
began to think about this as a kind of a state document as well, and what
Right.
state documents do. And I really enjoyed then thinking about the brilliant work of Hazel Carby, who talks about colonial archives in
Mm-hmm.
Jamaica in particular, and she thinks a lot about what these archives are doing. So I also I really started thinking about what do people think about when they're
Right.
writing these things down? What does someone think about when they're collecting these data?
Mm-hmm.
What does it feel like to be doing this? So I was particularly interested in that. And although that some of that is kind of has to be speculation, it can be rational speculation.
Mm-hmm.
But I also was then thinking about going back to these women and girls sewing things where they sometimes changed texts, which changed
Mm-hmm.
the meanings of the text entirely. So they were really intervening in the text that they were supposedly replicating. That was one thing. And then I came across another example of someone doing something I thought was just completely extraordinary, which was, and I just want to mention this because I love this story so much. But I came across the story of a man called John Longmire, who was a stonemason living in the Lake District, who presumably was suffering from some kind of severe mental anguish. And he engraved into the rocks onto the shore of Lake Windermere a set of logos and kind of political slogans that I only found out about because they were part of a collected set of pieces of material that were put together for an anti-slavery collection. And I eventually thought, oh, maybe they're still there. I'll go and see because they're not famous. So, Lake Windermere is quite big.
Okay.
But I did. I went to see and I found some of them,
Mm-hmm.
and they are right there, kind of on the shore of Lake Windermere. They are still there. Again, a kind of guerrilla inscription, if you will. They shouldn't be there. This is someone doing something illicit, doing something that shouldn't really be
Right.
done. And they do speak to enslavement. They speak to a set of things that I was really interested in. And this is where my kind of more literary scholarship came in. I was able to really do some close reading of what he had said at that point, and really think about what he might have been thinking about as he did this, but also think about Armistead's guerrilla inscription as part of a whole history of illicit writing that ranges from wood carvings to doodles to bits of sewing to carving on stones on the shore of Lake Windermere.
Well, I guess we should stop there before you say graffiti is something great and some people
It
might take
is. It
offense.
is. I don't mind if I offend people. It is. That's fine.
I'm going to ask this. We're going to go back to Armistead Ends Crafts here in a little bit, but do you, like, having found that story, do you feel like, ooh, I wish I had known, I would have loved to put that into the book?
Which story? Sorry.
The story of the guy making the engravings around
No,
Lake
it is.
Windermere?
That is in the book. That is in the book. That is in that chapter.
Must have missed that one.
Yeah, no, it's not a big part of it. And what it has made me think, actually, is I'd love to write a much longer piece about other forms of carving and illicit carving. And that I was speaking to a colleague
kind of
who
like
is
Napoleon in the pyramids.
all kinds of things. It would be really good. But I just think the trouble is, because I'm an enthusiast, once you get started, there's no stopping, is it? You'd never stop writing.
So, where you say that, and I jokingly bring up Napoleon, I think that there was a story that I told my kids that I think it was Mesa Verde National Park, where you have like these ancient Native American monuments in southwestern Colorado. And the school group visited, and they graffitied stuff, and the Park Service eventually set a bill to the teacher, I think, for some removal or something.
Yeah, that form of graffiti, I don't think it's a good idea. It should be avoided. That should definitely be avoided. But I do like those pieces of graffiti where you see maybe in an ancient cathedral or something that the stonemason has carved their name or something really bawdy, which no one's looking at. I do like that kind of subversive witnessing. Yeah.
Indeed. But going back to Armistead, because you use this entry of his guerrilla activity to kind of explore him too, and he seems like there have a lot of characters, but he seems sort of the perfect character to kind of trace this transatlantic nature of the conversation that these people are engaged in.
Yeah, I think he with the very earliest part of this work, when we were trying to think about how you'd reimagine this story for a very local audience in the way that I described right at the beginning of this podcast, he was the figure. It was him. Yeah. He was an extraordinary man. He collected so much material. He did so much. He was absolutely the heart of abolitionism in Leeds, but also internationally through hosting people at his house, through his friendships, through his constant writing activity, and through his very understated, very quiet presence. He did not draw attention to himself. He was an absolute stalwart who never wanted to be noticed. So this was also interesting to me. What's the relationship between the public people who stand up and talk about things, which he did do too, but also the people carrying out silent or very quiet work, often within their own homes. He did a lot of writing within his own home. How does that tie up all these different parts of abolition's complex way of being in the world? So Armistead is, I call him one of abolition's unsung heroes, and I think he was. I became interested too in the kind of before and after of Armistead. So what it was like for him before he went to the United States and then when he came back to the United States, because he visits the US for a period of a very few months in 1850, just at the height of the political activity around the Fugitive Slave Act. It's hard to find out a great deal about where he traveled or what he did, though he did write an account of it. And in this account, in fact, one of the really interesting things about this account is he produces the only, as far as I can tell, British edition of Thomas Jones's slave narrative, which he purchases or buys from Thomas Jones when he meets him by chance on a very short train journey. So again, it's one of these happenstance things that I'm really interested in this book. But what he also does is he meets for the first time large numbers of black abolitionists and indeed black people, because I think it is really important to think about kind of what this kind of face-to-face knowledge might have been like if you're a UK abolitionist, say, or German abolitionist, versus being a US abolitionist living in a more multiracial or biracial city. And as I've tried to suggest in the book, I think that going to the US and meeting the people that he met transformed something that was abstract and was about principles into something that was about people that he actually knew for the first time, groups of people that he had met and that he had talked with, and that he had, you know, he had seen something that he hadn't seen before. So I think that some, you know, as a writer, I'm really interested in going to the places I'm writing about and smelling the air or feeling the climate or looking at the flora and fauna and thinking about, you know, imagining it, even though obviously you can't really know what something is like 200 years previously or whatever. You can still, there's still stuff that you get from it. So I think for him, traveling to the US, as many of the people in this book are going backwards and forwards all the time, but traveling to the US, this changes everything. And I try to really explore that in the book. And what would it have meant to him? Well, huge. It meant everything. And I think when he comes back, I think as an abolitionist, he really changes.
Well, and it seemed like he was seeking out the individuals too. It was purposefully. He wanted to meet the kind of leading voices of people that he probably has read a lot about in the literature in the UK. So it seemed like maybe a terrible comparison. He wants to meet the heroes.
Yeah, and also I think he also wants to meet people who aren't heroic but are participants, important participants. Because he does want, you know, he had an introduction to William Lloyd Garrison, who wasn't in Boston when he first turned up. But he also he wasn't grandiose like that. I think he also just wanted to meet people and also see how things worked. So he walks about in Boston. He's taken for walks around the city by leading black figures. But he's a merchant. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that he then goes and has a look and sees how merchants are operating. So he's really interested in, you know, how people keep tables and books and things of that kind. He's an amateur meteorologist, so he's interested in the climate, he's interested in all of that stuff. So it's a kind of fully immersive experience. And he's also doing business when he's over there, so it's not just a private visit or a political visit, and it's also a family visit. I had never known until, well, quite recently, I didn't know where he had gone after he headed down to New York, because his account of his visit stops there. And I knew that he was planning, as he put it, to go west, which I suspected was Ohio or possibly Pennsylvania, but I wasn't quite sure. But I did manage to find out much later he had been to Philadelphia, but beyond that, I'm just not quite sure. So I can only tell bits of this story. But again, we're back to what you were suggesting earlier, where there isn't evidence for things. You just have to make certain assumptions.
Yeah, and so I think you made sort of the assumption that this connection that he makes in the US helps bring people like the Crafts to his house. Is it like that? Are they wanting people like I know there's inns in the UK at this stage, so hotels, but is it more acceptable to have the formerly enslaved stay with the abolitionist family? Was that common in these circles?
Yeah, it was common. It was common, I guess. It's free. You know, that makes a difference.
Yeah, no one's going to complain there.
No, and it's probably safer. You probably
Mm,
know that you're in an environment where you're not going to be harassed or abused or treated
mhm,
differently. Um, the Crofts were very young. They were still in their mid-20s.
mhm,
They're not they're young people. They need, they've had a terrible time. They need to be cared for. And also she's a woman.
mm, mm,
So, there are instances where there are, the nights that the Crafts are staying with the Armisteads, as I suggested, William Wells Brown is staying in some kind of paid
mm,
accommodation in the city.
mm,
But she's a woman and she had
mhm,
been unwell on the
mm,
journey or immediately after her journey across the
mm,
Atlantic. What that might mean, what being unwell might mean for a young woman of that period, it's not quite clear. One might
no,
speculate about what that might have meant about her.
mm,
But, she's clearly in need of support and care, and
mm,
perhaps also the company of other women rather than being in
mm,
a rented accommodation,
yeah,
an inn or something where it might be inappropriate for her to be
mm,
there. So it isn't uncommon at all. And I know that they hosted other people in their house. I'm
mm,
not entirely sure who. The house that they hosted the Crafts in um, is on the grounds where this university is built. And when the university was built, it was demolished, sadly. But they, by another piece of this kind of weird and curious story that I've told, the house that they then purchased and moved into was called Virginia Cottage. It had
mm,
been built for a local tobacco
mm.
manufacturer,
Right?
presumably using slave produced tobacco from Virginia, which is where he
Mm,
traded with it.
okay.
Um, they then purchased this house. So, from being a kind of, as it were, a house produced, well, not as it were, literally a
Mm,
house produced from the work of enslaved people, it then became a house lived in by an abolitionist and his family,
mm,
who is a place where he was actively writing
mm,
abolitionist work,
yeah,
presumably having people to stay with him at this point too.
mm,
So it is literally turned on its head. And one of the
mm,
kind of final pieces of the kind of public work that I've been doing was last year to have a blue plaque erected on this building, which is now a student accommodation at the
mm,
heart of the campus here, to both to speak to to their kind
mm,
of census activism, though it wasn't the house in which this happened, it's not where they were staying, but also to
mm,
speak of visiting African American abolitionists to Leeds and to name
mm,
them. So now this house is also part of a Black History Walk, so that visitors to
mm,
Leeds can come and be told of, not in just an abstract way, but in a very concrete way. Look, this
mm,
stuff was happening right here. And so also students staying there can know something about the history of this
mm,
house they were living in. And it's great to be teaching some of this material and take students 100 yards or so from this office and say, look, it was happening right here.
right. Mm.
It's not just about shopping and clubs, though it is about that in this city. It's about other things too.
And like it's like, for a history student, this is amazing to think of that you're learning about history that sits that was right next
Yeah.
to where you're learning it, and the stories then too of like, well, it's not there anymore because the university didn't seem that we needed to preserve it while we built this massive building,
Well, because the
essentially.
university wouldn't have known about it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it just,
yeah, that's the other part.
this happened a long, long time ago. The
Mhm.
university wouldn't have known about it. And,
Yeah.
I since part of what I'm interested in the book is thinking about layers of knowledge and things that
Mm.
have vanished, I also just think that's okay, actually, because we can
Yeah.
tell new stories out of things that have apparently gone. That,
Mhm.
that's a kind of an archive in a way, a kind of, or a piece of architecture that we can
Mm.
make speak again,
Mhm.
albeit through a different building. That
Mm.
doesn't mean we can't use that building to tell
Yeah.
this other story. And in a way, perhaps that kind of speaks quite well to all the different things I'm trying to do,
Mm.
in which I am trying to
Mm.
bring together what is that which is missing, and
Yeah.
say it's not silence. It can be made to speak. It can be a speakerly
Mhm.
thing. It's not just a silent thing. And it's not just the end of the story either. I really hope that students and not just students, but members of the public, other
Mhm.
people are seeking out these stories.
I'm going to have to remember speakily saying that. I love that. Geez, that was my kid. I'll give you credit.
Oh, don't worry. I don't think it's my original coinage.
No, it's interesting. Kind of trying to think here which direction I want to go here towards as we're drawing towards the end, but actually, let's go with the dissent, because you at the start were kind of like it's more than just religious dissenters. So let's towards the end now do what we probably should have done at the start. What you have Quakers, you have Moravians in there, so obviously dissenting religious groups you have, but how did you think of dissent when you looked at the book and sort of the organization structure writing?
So one of the things I say very early in the book is that dissent and dissident, both words that start to emerge in the 16th century, are semantically related, but they have different etymological roots. So they take you in different directions. One is about standing outside of the society in which you're in, being at variance with it. And the other, so to literally kind of be outside of it, to be dissident. And the other is to feel or act differently to the society within which you're located. And the people I look at, some of whom are religious dissenters, occupy both of these two positions. So I guess if we're thinking, if we're thinking of religious dissenters and we're thinking in a UK context, they're people who are not members of they dissent from the Church of England, right? So Quakers dissent from the Church of England. They're religious dissenters. They emerge from the Protestant Reformation in this way. Moravians are a bit more complicated because people thought of them as dissenters, but they would often say, well, we're not actually dissenters. We're loyal to the crown, and we are an Episcopal church, so we're not dissenters. But everyone thought they were dissenters. So they had this was a kind of real confusion about how they were perceived and what they were. The other thing I'd say about Moravians, as part of this story, by the way, is that Moravians are really vital to the story I tell and to its transnational element in particular, because they thought of themselves, they think of themselves absolutely within this transnational framework. So if you look up in the OED definition of the word diaspora, one of its key definitions is to do with the Moravian Church. They talk about some of their documents as diaspora documents. They imagine themselves as part of a transnational community that is not limited by the strictures of the nation state. And that's particularly helpful to the way I'm trying to theorize what this transnational story is. They're interesting in a much broader way, because I think some really brilliant scholarship is going on in the US about the Moravian Church in Pennsylvania and other parts of the US, and also about the Moravian Church in the West Indies. But Moravians have really gone under the radar in terms of thinking about them in the UK. But again, if you're here, where I'm living in Leeds, there's a Moravian settlement that's just down the road. It's about 5-7 miles away from here, and I'd never heard of Moravians before I moved here. I mean, I'm just wondering whether you, as a German, are more familiar with Moravians or not. No.
I consciously, I think one of the earliest encounters was sort of thinking of U.S. history, studying U.S. history, and sort of Moravians as sort of a religious group during the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening.
Yeah. So here, I mean, one of the difficulties for me as someone who can read some German very, very badly but doesn't speak it is a lot of their archives are in German. There are all sorts of access issues about them, but they are, I think I'm rambling away from the question you asked because I've forgotten what it was. But what I'm thinking
It's all
is about
right.
what
You
I'm
actually
thinking.
took the second question I was going to ask you
Oh,
already.
right. Well, okay. So, but what I realised was that though there have been studies of the Moravians in this country in terms of
Mm,
their religious history and so on. Um, they're often talked about when they're talked about in terms of the history of abolition, as if they are
mm,
abolitionists. Um,
right.
but they weren't. They
Right.
weren't.
You
They had a
make that
very
very
complicated, yeah.
clear.
They had a very complicated relation to
Mm,
abolition, and
mm,
I wanted to be clear about their connections to Quakers, which were very well established.
mm,
I wanted to be clear about the fact that in the period in which they're a kind of more dynamic force in the UK, local
mm,
people would have known who they were, something that's fallen out
mm,
of our knowledge. I wanted to
mm,
be clear that
right.
they had a very kind of complicated relationship to the idea of dissent and to
Mm,
religious dissent. And I wanted to be clear that they need a lot more work doing on them.
mm,
Um, and they are a really, really interesting group,
mm,
talented group of figures. In the original inception of this book, which didn't happen, I was going to have a chapter which was on Benjamin Latrobe, who
mm,
we think of as one of the key early architects of early America,
mm,
which he was. But actually, he was also a Yorkshire Moravian,
mm.
who was the son of
Wow.
a Pennsylvania-born Moravian who moved to the
Mm,
UK and an Irish Moravian who was
mm,
leaders of the Moravian Church in this country,
right.
um, who then went back and lived in the US and left the church, but
Mm,
was trained. Some of his early training was within the church, and then beyond that, his training was outside of the church, but kind of
mm,
within that framework. I didn't write on that in the end because I moved away from that because I became interested in
mm,
something else, basically,
right.
the chapter that I was writing about. But I really think that this is something that we need to really add to our knowledge of how
Mm,
significant Moravians were outside of religious culture in terms of shaping literary culture,
mm,
in shaping all sorts of things before, in some ways, at least in the UK, the churches still exist, and there are various Moravian settlements in Bristol, down near Bristol, in Yorkshire, and in Manchester, and in
mm,
Bedfordshire in this country. But it's a much smaller group of people. But obviously, if you go to Pennsylvania, if you
okay.
go to Bethlehem, if you go to
Mhm,
Nazareth in Pennsylvania, big settlements. And
mhm.
if you go to Tanzania, I think there's 27,000 Moravians living there. It's a big community, and it
Wow.
remains a diasporic community.
Right. No, and that's sort of where I was going to go with the last question for today. That I was sort of thinking of like you, you're doing a lot in the UK, but it is a transatlantic movement. It is that whether it's the Moravians in the Caribbean as teachers, or the Quakers in Pennsylvania, or Armistead going over to Boston to meet abolitionists, it is an abolition movement always was this sort of transatlantic movement that connected the mother country and the former colonies in that. So I don't know where the question is going to go, but I kind of feel like it's something that, especially in our age, is something really important to remember, how
Mm.
closely tied the Atlantic world in the 19th century was, right? Like students today, in 2 minutes, they can have an answer from somebody in the US. But
Yeah.
that wasn't the case then, but it still was for this time a very closely connected and closely knit community.
Yeah. And I think I'd even extend that though to say transnational because
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of, so many of the figures that I'm looking at had
Right, there.
connections with people who were moving to settling in Africa as
Mm-hmm.
well because
Yeah.
they were missionaries, or traveling to China
Mm-hmm.
because they were missionaries.
Yeah.
Um, Thinking of Anna Richardson again, one of the array of
Mm-hmm.
things she did was because she was a religious missionary at some level. She arranged to have Bibles translated into Chinese, and when Chinese sailors
Mm-hmm.
docked in Newcastle, went on board to deliver them these
Mm-hmm.
Bibles. So I think that the transatlantic element, and that is what I focus on in to some degree more than anything in this book, is only a part of the story. It's a transnational story. Thinking of the fourth chapter of the book where I do talk about the Moravians, quite a lot of my focus is actually on Egypt, and on John Anti's period of time that he spends in Egypt, and how some of the imagery that's used about his experiences there when he's a missionary there is actually speaking into a kind of history of visual iconography that's associated with Barbary, the stories of Barbary and Algerian corsairs and piracy, and it speaks back to a much longer history. So I'd just say all of these things. None of these things, rather than all of these things, I'd say none of these things can be studied in isolation because we're not isolates. We're just not. And this is not how these figures imagine themselves to be. I'd also want to add one other thing. I mean, I spoke about the German language. I also just want to imagine to realize that the figures that I'm studying were polyglot, many of them.
Yeah.
They were moving across different languages. They're moving between translations. They're relying, in many instances, this can be why knowledge becomes partial, because Wilson Armistead, for example, when he's thinking about the impact of Moravians and when he's thinking about their anti-slavery, it's because he doesn't read German. So he's relying on translations by other people, and they're only giving him partial knowledge. So he is looking at the bits and pieces they give him and telling a story in which the Moravians are heroic abolitionists, rather than looking at the evidence, which would suggest that it's a more complicated story than that. I don't want to castigate them, specifically. It's a very complicated thing where they held people as equals spiritually and often worked with them side by side, but did not emancipate them. Usually, in most instances, they didn't emancipate them. So actually, having access to multiple different languages enables all kinds of things too.
Yeah, I think that's the usual saying, right? Like if only we had more language capability and time to learn some.
Yeah, quite.
So, final thing, what was your favorite story or favorite item that you kind of tackled in the book?
That's a really difficult one, but I think I am going to stay with the stone carving on Lake Windermere.
Okay.
Not because it was my favorite thing per se, but because the day when I went and saw it there and experienced it and sat on the shore of Lake Windermere was absolutely magnificent. And it was really beautiful. It was a really beautiful aesthetic experience, a kind of encounter with nature, an encounter with silence, but also an imaginative, kind of transformatory thing, imaginatively. And so maybe it was that. It allowed me to think differently about everything else in the book. So maybe that.
Nice. That's a cool one.
Yeah.
Well, then I've taken up almost 2 hours of your time today, and I greatly appreciate that you were so kind in taking that time to talk about your book today. So it was very interesting and kind of nice to revisit the stories that you have and sort of hearing your thoughts behind some of it.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really lovely talking about it and reminding me about it as well, because you write these things and you kind of forget until you start to talk about them again, as I'm sure you know.
Yes, I agree. And if anyone listening is interested, Bridget Bennett's book is Antislavery in the Dissenting Atlantic, Archives and the Unquiet Libraries, 1776 to 1865.
And that's how
Wazowski
we know it's
Press.
an academic book, because it goes on forever. And it's got punctuation in the title. 2 pieces of punctuation in a title. It's a bit much, isn't it?
Well, that's how it is. Well, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And yeah, let's hope someone reads the book.
Yes. All right.